Sometime in the 9th century, in the mountain regions of what's now Sichuan or Shaanxi province, a group of Taoist alchemists were chasing a goal that had nothing to do with combat. They wanted to live forever. Convinced that the right blend of minerals could produce an elixir of eternal life, they spent years heating, mixing, and testing whatever substances they could source, working from recipes handed down through generations of mystical and medicinal practice. At some point, one batch brought together 3 ingredients: saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. Instead of granting immortality, it did something far more dramatic. It exploded. Historical records mention singed beards and burned out workshops, which says everything about how that first encounter actually unfolded. Nobody in that room was trying to build a weapon. They named the substance Hoyao, fire medicine, a label that still hints at its original identity as a failed pharmaceutical rather than the future engine of global conquest it would become. That one accidental, beard-scorching batch of failed immortality medicine went on to become arguably the most consequential chemical discovery in the history of warfare, the route from which every cannon, gun, and firearm on Earth would eventually branch. Getting from a botched potion in a Taoist lab to the modern firearm took a winding path. Bamboo tubes lashed to spears, a siege that proved the concept worked in real combat, centuries of steady refinement, and a slow migration of knowledge across an entire continent that ultimately rewrote the balance of military power everywhere. It's worth understanding the basic chemistry first, since it explains everything that followed. That original mixture combined potassium nitrate saltpeter with charcoal and sulfur in roughly a 75-15-10 ratio by weight. Saltpeter acted as an oxidizer, releasing oxygen rapidly under heat and fueling an extremely fast combustion reaction, a sudden, violent expansion of gas. That expanding gas is the underlying principle behind everything gunpowder would ever be used for, from lighting up a fireworks display to driving a metal projectile through armor plating. In its earliest known uses, gunpowder wasn't a weapon at all. It powered fireworks, smoke signals, and festival displays, exactly the kind of celebratory application you'd expect from a discovery made by monks pursuing immortality rather than military planners pursuing an edge in battle. For generations, most people in China only ever encountered gunpowder as spectacle, not threat. That changed once Song Dynasty military commanders recognized what the substance could really do. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, Chinese engineers built something called the huo chong, or fire lance, about as simple a weapon as one could design. Strap a bamboo tube to the end of a spear, pack it with gunpowder, and ignite it during close combat. The result was a polearm that shot flame and burning debris at anyone within striking distance, turning an ordinary spear into something far more terrifying to face. Defenders used fire lances during the siege of Dian in 1132, and by most accounts, the weapon performed exactly as hoped, scorching and disorienting attackers in ways ordinary spears simply couldn't. The psychological impact mattered as much as the physical damage. Soldiers trained for years in blade and spear combat suddenly found themselves facing an opponent who could throw fire itself. Once gunpowder proved its worth on a real battlefield, innovation moved quickly, with each step following logically from the last. Fire lance makers began stuffing pottery shards and pellets into the bamboo tubes alongside the powder, turning a flamethrower into something that also flung projectiles with real force. A genuinely significant shift, moving the weapon's function from intimidation toward actual penetrating injury at range, the same underlying concept every firearm since has relied on. The next obstacle was the bamboo itself, which couldn't survive stronger charges without splitting apart in the user's hands. Once craftsmen learned to cast bronze tubes tough enough to contain that pressure, the hand cannon was born. A weapon using expanding combustion gas to fire a single solid projectile with far more force and range than any bamboo tube ever managed. By the 13th century, metal-barreled hand cannons were in regular use across China. Engineers also scaled the concept up into devices with names like the thunderclap bomb and heaven-shaking cannon, capable of leveling fortifications once considered unbreakable. When the Mongols invaded China in the 1200s, they ran directly into these weapons during sieges like the defense of Kaifeng in 1232, and instead of simply losing to the new technology, they absorbed it. Once they'd conquered China and founded the Yuan dynasty, they carried gunpowder weaponry westward as their conquests expanded across Asia and into the Islamic world. It's one of history's more underrated technology transfers. Mongol military campaigns functioned almost like an accidental delivery network, spreading a Chinese invention across the breadth of Eurasia within a handful of generations, far faster than trade routes or diplomacy alone could have managed. Gunpowder's evolution wasn't a single straight line, either. Alongside hand cannons and fire lances, Chinese engineers also developed rockets and fire arrows, which spread not just through China, but into Korea and India along their own overlapping routes westward. Unlike the fire lance, which eventually faded out as true guns matured, rocketry persisted as its own separate branch, one that would resurface centuries later in European warfare, and much later still in the earliest ancestors of modern rocketry and spaceflight. In other words, this story doesn't lead only to the gun. It splits into two paths from the very same accidental discovery. One toward the firearm, one toward the rocket. Both born from a chemical reaction that a group of monks stumbled into while looking for something else entirely. From there, the technology fanned outward through overlapping routes into the Islamic world and eventually Europe, carried by military contact, trade, and the broader cross-cultural exchange that defined the 13th and 14th centuries. Gunpowder wasn't traveling alone, either. Paper, printing, and the magnetic compass moved along similar routes during roughly the same centuries, part of a much larger east-to-west flow of knowledge, long before anyone had a word like globalization for it. Some historians point out that early European cannon designs resemble Chinese originals closely enough that direct transmission seems far more likely than coincidence. Once gunpowder weapons reached Europe in the late 13th century, they landed in a political and military world they would spend the following centuries dismantling, eventually helping bring down systems of feudal military power that had held for hundreds of years. The change wasn't immediate. Early European hand cannons were, like their Chinese predecessors, crude and hard to aim. Essentially small cannons mounted awkwardly on poles. A soldier loaded powder and shot into the open end, touched a smoldering ember or cord to a small touch hole, and hoped the resulting blast went somewhere useful. Even in that primitive form, though, the weapon had a psychological and practical impact melee weapons couldn't match. Castle walls that had withstood siege equipment for generations began falling to cannon fire, and mounted knights, the backbone of medieval European warfare, found themselves newly vulnerable to a weapon indifferent to how much steel they wore. The entire social order built around expensive, heavily armored cavalry began to wobble, since a comparatively cheap weapon in the hands of a much less expensively trained soldier could now neutralize a knight who'd spent a lifetime and fortune preparing for combat the old way. This ripple effect reshaped the very architecture of European warfare. As cannons grew more powerful against tall stone walls, the traditional castle, built for repelling scaling attackers and arrows, became dangerously outdated, almost overnight in historical terms. Military engineers responded with the Star Fort and the Bastion, lower, angled, heavily reinforced structures built specifically to deflect cannon fire rather than simply stand tall and hope. The medieval castle, a fixture of the European landscape for centuries, was gradually replaced by structures that barely resembled it, all triggered by a weapon that had originated half a world away in the hands of monks chasing immortality. The next genuinely major leap came in the late 15th century with the matchlock mechanism, the development that finally turned gunpowder weapons from clumsy novelties into the backbone of organized infantry warfare. The core problem with earlier hand cannons was that firing one took two hands and careful coordination. One to steady the weapon, the other to apply a burning ember or cord to the touch hole at just the right instant, all while trying to aim at a moving target in the chaos of battle. The matchlock solved this by attaching a slow-burning cord, held in a curved clamp called a serpentine, directly to the weapon. Pulling the trigger lowered that already lit cord into a small pan of priming powder, igniting the charge automatically and freeing the shooter to hold and aim with both hands right up to the moment of firing. It sounds like a small mechanical tweak, but it was the first mechanical firing device ever applied to a handheld weapon, and it let a single trained soldier fire with a real degree of aimed precision for the first time in history. By the early 15th century, matchlock arquebuses were spreading across Western Europe, particularly Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, and from there across the breadth of Eurasia. The Ottoman Empire, already experienced with gunpowder since the 14th century, folded matchlocks directly into its elite Janissary corps, using them to strong effect at engagements like the Battle of Goa in 1510, alongside Portuguese forces who relied on the same technology. In 1543, Portuguese traders brought matchlocks to Japan, where local gunsmiths refined the design so thoroughly that Japanese matchlocks, known as Tanegashima, came to be regarded as some of the finest firearms made anywhere in the world at the time. China itself, having started this whole chain of innovation centuries earlier, ended up reabsorbing an improved version of its own invention, developing matchlock birding guns, specifically to counter Mongol incursions on its northern frontier. A fittingly strange loop for a technology that began as a failed immortality potion in that same region. Matchlock muskets eventually grew heavy enough, up to 25 pounds in some builds, to need a forked rest just to support the barrel, but they could punch through plate armor at ranges that made swords and pikes increasingly beside the point. Because reloading took time and left the shooter briefly exposed, musketeers typically needed protection from pikemen standing beside them. This pike and shot combination dominated European battlefields from the 16th into the early 17th century, an intricate tactical system requiring extensive coordination between musketeers and pikemen in tightly organized formations. Many armies outside Europe that adopted matchlocks kept their traditional formations instead, lacking either the resources or the specific tactical pressure that pushed European armies toward this particular style of combined arms warfare. The matchlock had one obvious weakness. Everyone using it understood. It needed an open, slow-burning flame at all times, which made it nearly useless in rain, gave away a soldier's position at night, and required constant upkeep, even when nothing was happening. The fix arrived in stages. The wheellock, developed in the early 16th century, used a spring-loaded wheel spinning against a piece of pyrite to throw sparks, removing the need for a constantly burning cord. A real advantage for cavalry, who needed weapons they could carry loaded and ready without tending an open flame on horseback. German mercenaries and English cavalry became particularly associated with the mechanism during this period, but wheellocks were expensive and mechanically complicated to build, which kept them from replacing the cheaper matchlock among ordinary infantry, who carried the older design well into the following century, even as wealthier cavalrymen rode with the newer one. The real breakthrough was the flintlock, generally credited to French gunsmith Marin Le Bourgeois, who developed its recognizable modern form around 1610-1615. The flintlock used a spring-loaded hammer holding a piece of flint that struck a steel surface called a frizzen, throwing sparks directly into the priming pan and igniting the charge. It fired faster than a matchlock, worked far more reliably in bad weather, and needed no open flame at all, meaning soldiers no longer gave away their position in the dark just by carrying a lit weapon. By the 1630s, the flintlock had spread rapidly across Europe, with the Dutch States Army among the first to adopt it as standard infantry issue. Within a few decades, it had become the dominant firearm mechanism across nearly every major European military, a position it held for roughly 2 centuries, through colonial expansion, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Revolution, where flintlock muskets carried by both colonial militias and British regulars defined the entire conflict. The flintlock's arrival coincided with another crucial innovation, the socket bayonet, introduced in the late 17th century, which attached around the outside of the barrel via a metal ring rather than plugging into the muzzle the way earlier plug bayonets had, a design that had made it impossible to fire the gun while the bayonet was attached. This small change meant a soldier could fix a bayonet and still fire normally, combining ranged and close combat capability in a single weapon for the first time. The practical effect was enormous. Armies no longer needed dedicated pikemen protecting their musketeers, since every soldier with a flintlock and bayonet could now serve as both shooter and spearman as the moment demanded. This shift, sometimes called the Infantry Revolution, simplified training and logistics, and reshaped how European armies organized on the battlefield, letting regiments engage at range or in close combat without reorganizing between the two. The bayonet charge also carried its own psychological weight. The sight of an advancing line with fixed bayonets often broke enemy morale before a single blow landed. The flintlock's roughly 2-century run ended in the early 19th century with the percussion cap, a small metal cap containing a shock-sensitive compound that ignited instantly when struck, eliminating the need for loose priming powder, flint, and steel altogether. This final ignition innovation made every earlier mechanism, matchlock, wheellock, flintlock, essentially obsolete within a few decades, marking the last major milestone in a chain of refinement stretching back to monks chasing immortality in 9th century China. From there, change only accelerated. Repeating rifles, rapid advances in metallurgy and manufacturing, and eventually weapons that would have been completely unrecognizable to soldiers who once stood in disciplined lines with pikes and matchlocks, waiting their turn to fire. Looking back across the whole arc, from a Taoist alchemy lab in 9th century China to flintlock muskets dominating European battlefields nearly 8 centuries later, the story of how humans built the firearm is really a story about accident, accumulation, and migration unfolding together over an enormous stretch of time. Nobody set out on day one to invent a weapon. A group of monks searching for immortality stumbled into an explosive chemical reaction and nearly burned their own beards off doing it. Military engineers who witnessed that explosive violence gradually realized it could be channeled, first through a tube lashed to a spear, then through a cast bronze cylinder, then through increasingly refined mechanical systems designed to trigger that same basic chemical reaction more reliably, more quickly, and more safely for the person holding it. Every improvement along the way, bamboo to bronze, open flame to spring-loaded mechanism, matchlock to flintlock, solved a specific, practical problem soldiers and engineers had actually run into with whatever came before. None of it needed one singular genius flash of invention. It needed centuries of incremental refinement, carried across continents by trade routes, military campaigns, and the slow cultural exchange that quietly reshapes the world while almost no one is watching closely enough to notice. Passing from Chinese engineers to Mongol conquerors, to Ottoman janissaries, to Japanese gunsmiths, to European craftsmen, each adding their own piece along the way. The weapon that would eventually end the dominance of mounted knights, reshape castle architecture, and help determine the outcome of colonial conquest and continental wars across centuries began its life as a mistake made by people who weren't trying to build a weapon at all. They were only looking for a way to live forever.